I'm Rowan Williams, a former Archbishop of Canterbury and former Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge.
I'm Jude Kelly, a theatre director, producer, and founder of the WOW Women of the World Foundation.
Jude, I've been thinking quite a bit recently about how we educate the imagination, because thinking of the kind of deadlock we seem to be in culturally and politically at the moment, it does seem to me that part of what we're suffering from is what I'd call uneducated imagination. We don't know how to foster, develop, and sharpen people's imagination. How do we set about that, do you think? Because that seems to me one of the largely ignored questions we're living with at the moment.
That's a great question. And it's interesting how we normally ascribe the imagination to fantasy. A common way of talking about the imagination is to say of children, they've got a wild imagination or they've got too much imagination, suggesting that the sort of boundaries of their imagery is kind of almost unseemly at times. I don't think children make the distinction between investigating monsters and butterflies and all of those things. They don't make a distinction between that and fashioning what an amazing world would be that they would feel good in or bad in. So there's a kind of a wonderful period that children are in when they're playing with the boundaries of imagination. And too often adults imply that this is something that that is inappropriate. So the first thing is that we're scared of the imagination. We don't know how to use it well. And this is all part of, I suppose, releasing the human from the idea that they have to stay in quite a small box that society, religions, philosophies have put them in until they've acquired the permission to kind of move out of the box and start exploring. So there's a lot of issues around closing down the imagination in order to remain appropriate to the station that you're in society. And I mean, I was brought up with people saying things like, well, you mustn't give people too much education because otherwise who'll empty the bins? Or, you mustn't give people access to their imagination because it might make them have dreams that they can't then deal with. So I find that place of the imagination full of censure. And that's also, incidentally, why I think that we often in society are quite frightened of the idea of artistic expression, because, we don't, and who knows where it will lead. And in the same way that we repress emotional extremes, and we are worried about personal emotional intimacy with ourselves. So they're all tools that I think we've never really learnt to use well in terms of the democracy of the imagination, the democracy of emotion. But, the other thing about the imagination is that we very rarely apply the word moral to the imagination. So we have this idea that imagination goes wild, and it can be gothic, it can be sort of hysterical, all of those sorts of things. But I don't know how else we ever have fashioned a future world unless we've found a way of imagining something which we've never experienced, and then walking our way towards it. Now, we're very comfortable with the idea that entrepreneurs and inventors can have a hunch about something that they've never seen, and then they work backwards from the hunch, exploring how you get there. The process of making art often operates in the same way. I have a feeling about this story, and I'm going to kind of work my way towards it. But I think it's true of society as well, that somebody had to imagine that there'd come a point when you would be able to get rid of malaria, and how would you do that? But it wasn't just about the method, i.e. the vaccines or the sewerage systems or whatever. It was the concept of a world free of that pain, and that's what I would call the moral imagination. That the need to, I mean, I'll get round to your point, like, how do we train it? Well, first of all, we have to let people know when they're children that they have an imagination, that it sits inside them somewhere mysteriously, and that it's theirs for use. And then we have to, I think, train people to go, how will you use your imagination? How would you like to use it? Let's imagine today that we are going to make a world that's free of poisons. What would you do? What does that world look like? So I think it's like all other muscles. You have to regularly exercise it. You have to apply it to things, and you have to come back and check it and make sure that it's something that is being of use in a number of ways. And so that's what I feel, that we're on the verge of thinking, how do you give people the right to their imaginations, encourage them to have moral imaginations, and not say that that is based on a rule book that's already been written in patriarchal terms or white supremacist terms or any other terms that would then say there's a decision made already about what morality looks like.
I really like this phrase, moral imagination, which I've used myself at times in the past, because it seems to me to be exactly what your earlier phrase sort of contains within itself, a world we can feel good in. And that in turn, I think, implies that part of the imagination is actually protest too. We sense this is a world in which it's hard to feel good, and that shouldn't be, and it doesn't have to be. There could be an environment in which we felt at some level more deeply at home with one another, and that means at times intensifying our consciousness of what's wrong, what's jarring. So I think if we're talking about the life of the imagination, the moral imagination, it's not just, is it thinking about somewhere over the rainbow? It's also recognizing the wrongness of what's there and how that wrongness is our problem as it's everybody else's problem. But I also really resonated with what you said about the fear that generates in so many of us. All these recent discussions about the role of subjects connected with art and creativity in higher education, this is really disturbing, because you hear people saying, describing these things as vanity projects. I think that was the word of one senior educator. And I think vanity projects, the vanity project is what reflects you as you are, or as you'd like to think you are. But the imaginative project is the exact opposite of the vanity project, because it says, I and everybody around me actually needs to change. And only by deploying imagination can we get the energy to change.
Yes, that was a very unfortunate phrase, which I believe he's apologized for, the Vice Chancellor who used it.
Yes, I think so.
But it was symbolic, unfortunately, of an idea that that something is only useful if we know how to use it now, and if it can have an application now, which takes away this kind of the mystery of progress, because progress is a kind of mystery. Rowan, that I'm not religious, but I think that the idea that humans can sort of control everything and organize it in a logical manner, it doesn't fit with the idea of a much greater sort of spiritual universe where humans cannot control things, and therefore we're forced, and we should be forced, into exploring things that have doubt and uncertainty and no clarity of resolution and no certainty of outcome. Because without that, there's no adventure, there's no serendipity, and also I think I would say that is vanity. I would say the vanity is in feeling as if we know what's needed now, and we're the best persons to decide. Whereas the release of the imagination in individuals, in groups, is really what we need to strive for. So if I can just give an example of something that is that bearing in mind that this particular chap who said it was an Australian, for years, and years and years, the First Nations imagination in Australia was utterly suppressed as being irrelevant and and pre-modern and therefore useless. And now there is a rush to access that wisdom, that knowledge, because it isn't about pre or post progress. It's about a layering of imagination and an access to wisdom. So, and that relies on an idea of ancestral wisdom and something that's, you know, beyond our current understanding. So I suppose there's it's hubris to me for humans to go, we are in charge of everything, and what we see is what we own. Only what we see is what we want. Mm-hmm. And I think that part of identity politics, which I know gets a bad rap, but essentially identity politics is a lot about people practicing unearthing feelings that they've been told are not relevant or are of lower status. And even though that's quite chaotic at the moment, and can feel chaotic, it pushes aside a lot of certainties. And while people have these, you know, what you call vanity projects, where they're exploring new things and new themes, and they will be of use someday. I have no doubt about that.
One of the things I often want to say in debates about so-called identity politics these days is, well, of course it's chaotic, and of course it's rather sharp-edged, and it feels confusing. It feels a bit mad at times. But this is really about how we deal with what's been suppressed, what's been silenced, and of course it's chaotic when it comes to the surface. Don't rush it, because it needs to be out there. It needs to be talked about and looked at and communally discerned and processed. And yes, it's going to be painful. Get used to it. But it's much stupider and much more destructive if you say, well, it ought not to be out there. And that's
yes.
hard to hear something.
Well, I mean, one of the things I always love about you, Rowan, which is, and why, you know, you shed various skins or chrysalises in order to have even bigger wings the longer I've known you. And, you know, I think that the idea of empathy, I mean, part of the imagination is for empathy, to go, well, I'm not you, but I can imagine being you, and I can imagine the pain of being you as well as the joy of being you, and I'm going to stand alongside you with that. And of course, you know, a huge barrier to empathy is when people have told you what you should or shouldn't identify with. You know, that it's dangerous to kind of identify with certain sorts of things because somehow you're being sucked in and you'll be infected by it, and it's etc. Whereas what you're saying, which I really love, is, you know, muddle around there along with it all. You know, to demand somebody else sticks to certainties that you feel okay about so that you don't feel uncomfortable is selfish and short-sighted. So we're often with identity politics talking about people who've suffered massive pain and insecurities and obliteration almost at times, so that we can feel certain about our place. And now they're cracking open all of this ground, and we're finding that we're falling into sinkholes occasionally. But you're right, you know, so be it, and we will learn from that. It will find its own place. Yeah,
I'm really confident of that. But the key word is learn there, isn't it? I've just been reading Nigel Tubbs's new book, Socrates on Trial, which is a fantastic book of philosophical dialogue. But at the heart of it, two great themes. One is that all real education is learning about learning. How do we learn? How did we come to be the way we are? Which includes both the surface processes of, you know, acquiring knowledge and skills, but also the undercurrents, which I think you were referring to, the sort of roots of our identity, which are often very opaque to us, learning about how all that comes together. The second thing is, how do we get away from the fundamental mistake, you might say, of treating knowledge as property, as something that can be contained, wrapped up, sealed off, and sort of tossed around like a rugby ball. Because no, sorry, finish, please. No, because if we treat knowledge like that, it means that this property relationship somehow affects everything, our attitude to the world around us, our attitude to other people. What if it's not about possessing?
Well, of course, this is where unlearning comes in.
Yes.
Something I'm very interested in. You know, I'm a woman now in my 60s. I was taught things about, you know, my place in the world, other people's place in the world, and that knowledge was part of my security, even, and as I, you know, objected to being told where my place was, it didn't always occur to me that I might also be oppressing somebody else's place because of the other bits of certainties that I was quite happy to have. And part of that is this idea of where knowledge is validated.
Yes.
You know, the legitimacy issue. Which I know is causing, you know, academia to have a great deal of anguish, as it, you know, has a kind of almost existential crisis, really, about what's the legitimacy of certain kinds of knowledge in the way that they're packaged and the way they're described in the sort of jargon that goes with them. And, you know, so if you just take the canon, for example, I mean, speaking as an artist, it's tremendously troubling for me now to have, on the one hand, gorgeous and amazing literature, music, philosophy, etc., which I have found tremendously nourishing over all my life. However, packed in, baked in, absolutely central to it is male creativity and male ideas of the way the world is constructed, to the point when, you know, sometimes I think, I don't think I can look at any of this anymore, which of course would be, that's like having my own personal Chinese cultural revolution, where I'd have to kind of upend everything that I've loved in order to kind of reach a scorched earth space to start all over again. Can you do that? I don't, you know, I don't recommend it in a way. So I'm sort of struggling myself personally, and I'm sure lots of other people are, to kind of go, all this knowledge that I was told was supreme knowledge, the best knowledge, it has a kind of commodity element to it, which is, this is the stuff that you've got to buy into. And now I'm interested more in, a bit like thinking of it all like a scattered Lego set. You think, well, I'll have to put those bricks together in different ways, and there's lots of bricks that aren't even here. But if what your point is, which is that if so much of knowledge has been kind of commodified and sold back to people, you know, you obviously, at a very personal level at universities, people buy it.
Yes.
It gets you your qualifications. That will take you into the city. If it's in finance, it'll take you into law. If you're in the legal system, I mean, it's so commercially related to the way our industries all work, and that's why it has that kind of hierarchy. But I don't think we can reach a next stage of wisdom unless we reconstruct it and put alongside some of that formal knowledge other kinds of knowledges, and also recognize what some of that knowledge has done that's damaging. But again, it's a long process, isn't it? I mean, do you sometimes, I mean, I used to think I was going to be alive long enough to see gender equality. I no longer think that. But, you know, I no longer think I'm going to be alive to see some of the most exciting revolutions in the way humans think about all this stuff. And I wish I was going to be around, but I don't think I will be, because it's going to take a long time, isn't it, to get to grips with this disintegration of certainty, whilst you then build back new ideas.
Yeah, I think that time scale is a key dimension of what we have to get used to. But we are very impatient. We would like it to be sorted quickly. But the processes of learning do take time. They take enormous time. And thinking of the canon, as you were talking about it then, the problem is, and I think the temptation of the scorched earth thing that you talk about, the problem is it's very easy to expect people we think are great and beautiful and wonderful to be right. But of course they were learning. They're part of a process of learning. And there's that wonderful dictum, which I think T.S. Eliot, wasn't it, who said, "We know so much more than our ancestors did. Yes, but they are what we know." And that captures something of it. In other words, what we learn about is their learning as well. It's not that we say, oh, well, Shakespeare was some kind of racist or patriarchalist, therefore King Lear must be a bad play. Whoa. I'm going to stop you there, so to speak. But we now read King Lear with an awareness that Shakespeare belongs in his time, and that's all right. He doesn't have to be right, but we need to be able to ask the question and say, all right, so how do we now aim off in our reading so as not just to buy into that as a neatly sealed off text that we simply absolutize? And that's quite a delicate line to walk. It is
a delicate line. And of course, some people have permission to be, disruptive to that. And some people don't. And a lot of people feel they don't. And in terms of certainties, whether you're talking about, the teacher teaching English literature or, whatever, it's hard, I think, at the moment. I mean, let's just talk about that whole kind of issue of decolonization of the canon. People feel scared of doing something wrong. They're not sure whether if you critique history that you're somehow putting a slur on ancestors. So that there's a lot of nervousness around how you deconstruct gracefully but candidly, and who's allowed to do it. It's somehow, if there's anger around it, people somehow feel that that's less legitimate too, which is a problem.
Which is a problem.
Rowan, on this very important call, I'm just going to acknowledge the fact in this time of COVID and Zooms that I have a 3-year-old here and 3-year-old girl. And actually, it is relevant because when you look at a child, I'll just show the viewers. Judy, say hello.
Hello.
So when you're thinking about children, and I know, Rowan, that you've just literally had a grandchild yesterday, going back to this idea of a moral imagination, it fires you up so quickly to think, what's the world we want to bring them into and what tools and equipment do we want to give them? But for some people, that becomes, how do we force them to have the same cultural certainties that we did?
Yes. Rather than inducting them into habits of learning, habits of discernment, which may be inducting them into how to disagree with us, or how to disagree, as you say, gracefully and constructively with us. And that's quite an educative task, isn't it? Not asking that you reproduce your views through another's mouth or another's eyes, but how you bring them into a discourse, or you yourself let yourself be brought into a discourse where there can be a possibly transformative exchange between you. That's the skill of educating, I think, and it's a tough one. And most of our educational practice completely sidelines those questions.
Yeah, and I also think that one of the complicated things about all this is love. Excuse me, I can't stop her bouncing on the bed, I'm afraid. But the Judy, 1 second. A lot of people try to stop people doing things because they love them, and they want to be loved. And a way that you show your love is by not disrespecting their previous views. And you also show your love for somebody by stopping them do something dangerous. Family life. So you stop them doing something dangerous by going into areas of thought that will have no resolution. Certainty is what people want to give people they love. I want you to be happy. I want you to feel belonging. I want you to have the admiration of your grandparents, etc., etc., etc. And so a lot of resistance to places of the imagination, going back to my point about, your imagination is a bit wild, maybe, you need to calm down a bit, is because fear of somebody not having certainties, we pass it on to the people that we love. And that's I would say that's almost more difficult it's easy to be angry with people that you disrespect,
Yes.
and that you don't know. It's incredibly difficult to struggle for change when you're surrounded by love.
Yes.
And that love is trying to hold you back.
I think that's a wonderful way of characterizing it, because, of course, one of the curses of our age is that we have lots and lots of vehicles, lots and lots of structures that help us to be angry with people we needn't respect or love. But the real job, the real constructive job, is working on changing relations with those we do love. And if, in some sense, you want to try to love the world you're in and the humanity you're part of, then that's what you have to strive for. And obviously, from my own religious perspective, that's absolutely central to anything that can be said about love. And unfortunately, we're not brilliant as religious people in embodying that.
Well, again, I think this is where the imagination comes in, because you know, there's a wonderful poem that I read recently, a female Muslim poet, fantastic, passionate poem about saying, you know, I'm always being asked to sort of demonstrate that I'm a good person, I'm a good Muslim, you know, and I do it by showing that I like the same sitcoms as you do. I do it by showing that, you know, we shop at the same shops. In other words, I normalize myself into your life to kind of go, so look, you can love me. But, you know, actually, I want you to love me when I'm dirty. I want you to love me when I'm hopeless. I want you to love me when I'm nasty. I want you to love me as a Muslim who's not a nice Muslim. Just love me because I'm a human. And if you need me to demonstrate how I am lovable, then basically you are not someone capable of love. And I think that, you know, for me, sums up this idea that conditional loving based on good behavior is another reason why the imagination is stunted, because you have to love people beyond the idea of them pleasing you or making you feel okay.
I'll take that back to the whole notion of the moral imagination, and you could say that what's fundamentally moral is looking at another person and saying, you do not have to earn my respect, you do not have to earn my love, you can take it for granted. And if you can't take it for granted, let me know, because I need to know.
You know, we talk a lot about the moment, about the systems that need to be upended in order to realize human equality and human justice. And the interesting thing, I think, at the moment is that the conversations around justice to the planet as a whole, i.e. us downscaling our sense of power, or what power should look like in relationship to the planet, even though that conversation is happening and it's happening urgently, I'm not sure that we are scouring out the issues of equality as humans with the same vigor sometimes as we are scouring out the kind of relationship to us and the planet. I mean, and it might be because, you know, the planet is beginning to threaten us in a way that we're going to go, wow, this really feels dangerous. Whereas the sort of things that are everyday injustices about hierarchies of power don't have quite the same danger necessarily.
That's interesting, because I think it's really essential in the moment we're in, especially with regard to the environment, to hang on to the idea that doing justice is indivisible, and that to relate non-possessively, respectfully, lovingly to one another as fellow humans and to the planet. These just do belong together. They have the same root, they have the same effects. They're all about the dispossession that we have to learn. And if we try to make them competitors in any way, then we've really got a problem, because you can end up, you can end up with certain kinds of ecological fascism, which just short-circuit the urgent human issues about poverty, gender, and all the rest of it. Or we can narrowly focus on getting our human business right, forgetting that we are, as some people like to say, a wholly owned subsidiary of the planet. Actually, we just are part of the planet. And And we were talking.
Rowan, I want to ask you. No, I want to ask you a question about religion, because my upbringing, which was Christian, had lots and lots of ideas of hierarchy implicit in it. You know, all things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small. You know, there's a kind of a sense of some things are big and some things are little, but unfortunately God loves them all. But you also, you know, as a woman, as a child, you know, the whole idea of what the Bible says, written in the time that it was written, has given such kind of clear guidelines about power structures. And I mean, I'm imagining that must be quite a wrestling match for you now, because the idea of justice, equality and justice, requires us not just to do sort of general interpretive dances around the theologies that have ruled societies, but maybe to kind of imagine new theologies altogether. At least that's how I am thinking. Where do you stand on this idea of the imagination in relationship to theologies?
Well, I'd connected a bit with this idea that there's always learning and there's always turmoil associated with learning. All through the history of the reading of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, there have been moments where people have said, wait a minute, if that bit is serious, then we have somehow to see that other bit in the light of it. If, for example, a statement about the privilege or the dignity of the outsider, the migrant, if that's very clear in parts of the Old Testament as it is, then that has to be somehow offsetting particular kinds of xenophobia, particular kinds of particularism. There's something about the stranger, something about the foreigner, which is sacred. Now, go and think about that. Or look at St. Paul. He has all sorts of patriarchal things to say, and then he says, very unexpectedly, that in marriage, the woman's body belongs to the man. You think, yeah, and that's what everybody thought in the first, and the man's body belongs to the woman. And we forget how startling that must have been in its own context. Something is coming into focus which wasn't there before. Or Jesus himself talking about listening to children and what children, becoming like children. These are your teachers. Now, all of those things are there in Scripture, and you can see that over the centuries, they've often been softened, relativized, acclimatized to what you might call the majority verdict. And then they wriggle through, they push up through the concrete, and they start creating more cracks in the concrete, and things begin to shift. In other kinds of imagery, I've sometimes talked about the slow fuse of bits of the Bible, which takes centuries to actually explode, whether it's in terms of attitudes to women, children, or slavery, or sexuality, whatever. So that's part of the process I see my own community of faith being involved in, pretty slowly and not always very impressively, but actually it's what we've been doing one way or another across the centuries, if only we were a bit more honest about it sometimes.
I suppose that's one of the things I'd like to kind of close on, really, which is the relationship between imagination and speed. Once you've dreamt something is possible, you're impatient to realize it. And if there are things in the way of that dream, you know, your imagination is compelling you forward to find a solution, to find a realization, etc. Of course, you know, you're aware that you need to have patience, need to be realistic. But when other people keep on saying, well, look, actually, could you slow down because we're not ready for it? It's a tricky one to ask, particularly if the people asking it have the relaxation of time and power at their disposal. And so, you know, I have found it a matter of big impatience for me. This, what, if you like, the fuse doesn't light quick enough for me in lots of these places. And I am much more interested in the idea of what a new theology looks like, where, you know, sometimes you think, well, can you genuinely move something forward if it's been built on a landscape of, different kinds of almost implacably certain ideas of power. And I don't know.
No.
Probably for me, no. For you, yes.
Yes.
But this is where our imagination counts.
I think so. But you're right to say that, of course, appeals for patience from people who have the luxury of power, or the power of luxury, who have the leisure to think about it, don't sound very convincing, I grant. But at the same time, I used to say sometimes when I was in office as Archbishop, if a decision takes longer to take, but is really taken when it gets taken so that it sticks, then maybe it's worth the time. But who says that? Who imposes it? That's the problem, because it can indeed be a corrupting reiteration of existing power forms. So it's another knife edge, and I don't expect to be comfortable about it, and I don't see why we should. That too is something to do with learning, I guess. But thanks, Jude. That's so illuminating and helpful. Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you, as always.
As always.
We're glad we exist.